Chapter 6. Much Ado About Nothing? Freddy Adu and Neoliberal Racism in New Millennium America. By Kyle W. Coos. 6 years after his family immigrated to the United States from Tema, Ghana, Freddy Adu made American sporting history. In 2004, at the age of 14, he became the youngest male to play in an American professional sporting event when he debuted for DC United. Broadcast to a national television audience, the opening game of the 2004 Major League Soccer (MLS) campaign had been hyped for weeks by the league, ABC, and ESPN as Freddy Adu's debut. As Adu was cast as the savior of American soccer in the media, MLS instantly turned him into its public face. The league's commodification of Adu paid dividends. Road attendance figures for DC United increased by 40%, while television ratings increased by 50% when DC United featured in ESPN's MLS Match of the Week. DC United jerseys and t-shirts adorned with Adu 9 appeared all across the United States. During his rookie season, MLS telecasts were even interrupted by Sierra Mist commercials featuring Adu facing off in a juggling duel with soccer great, Pelé. Aware of his immense global marketing potential, Nike quickly signed the 14-year-old Phenom to an endorsement deal for $1 million, a bargain if Adu lives up to his purported world-class footballing potential. Through the coordinated efforts of MLS, Nike, Pepsi, and the American/global sports media complex, Adu's moment of turning pro was transformed into Freddy Mania, a commodified media spectacle celebrating what Sport.com called Adu's modern American dream story. Freddy Mania was produced across disparate American media platforms such as ESPN's SportsCenter and Pardon the Interruption, 60 Minutes, The Late Show with David Letterman, and MTV's TRL, Total Request Live, not to mention additional media outlets across the globe. Adu's emergent sporting celebrity and commodification is peculiar considering the American sporting establishment's historical disdain for soccer. Yet, on one level, Freddy Mania arises from, and is a productive force in, recent efforts to cultivate a potentially lucrative soccer market in the United States. So, even the most rudimentary understanding of Freddy Mania requires situating Adu's sporting celebrity in the context of the recent efforts of global sport media behemoths like Nike, Adidas, Disney, and News Corporation to transform the United States into a soccer marketing goldmine. But, to understand how the dark black-skinned, Ghanaian-born, Americanized teenager Adu was rather easily and regularly commodified as a distinctly American sporting celebrity, I argue Freddy Mania must be situated in the racial context of New Millennium America. More specifically, critical attention must be given to the particular ways in which Adu was racialized through the media and promotional culture, recognizing this racialization as an instrument and effect of what Henry Giroux calls neoliberal racism. Only after situating the spectacle of Freddy Mania within the context of neoliberal racism can one recognize how it functions as a form of popular pedagogy through which the ideas and logics of the neoliberal racial imaginary get naturalized as racial common sense. Because Freddy Mania, at first glance, appears to offer a seemingly hopeful, optimistic, and inspiring racial narrative celebrating a smiling, affable, and hard-working Adu, and his mother, as contemporary embodiments of the American dream, it is difficult to notice the retrogressive racial politics that invisibly organize this commercialized media spectacle. So, my analysis will reveal the selective and strategic ways in which Adu's blackness, coded both as recent African immigrant and as post-racial American, is made to matter, and not matter, through Freddy Mania so that neoliberal, white, America appears as an open, inclusive, and colorblind society fully supportive of people of color, provided they invest in neoliberal values, practices, and relations. Yet, my analysis will also uncover how Adu's African/post-racial/recent immigrant American blackness is only afforded a precarious, limited, and conditional place within the imagined American community, that is, to the extent that his unique form of blackness enables neoliberal, white, America to produce profits and recognize itself as beyond race and open to all individuals with a will to make their American dream a reality. Neoliberal racism. Giroux argues that in New Millennium America the socio-economic philosophy of neoliberalism has been articulated with conservative understandings of race and racism to produce a new form of racism he calls neoliberal racism. For Giroux, neoliberalism is defined primarily through the privileging of market relations, deregulation, privatization, and consumerism. Central to neoliberalism is the assumption that profit-making be construed as the essence of democracy and consuming as the most cherished act of citizenship. Neoliberalism calls for a narrow role for the state centered on the establishment and maintenance of social and economic conditions that enable corporations and entrepreneurial individuals to maximize their money-making potential. In particular, the state's main functions in the neoliberal imaginary are to maintain social order and racial control, cultivate consumption among its citizens, and reduce or eliminate social welfare programs for America's most vulnerable populations. Neoliberal racism, for Giroux, is most often constituted in and through a language of racial color blindness that evades explicit race talk in public. Proponents of neoliberal racism evade race talk because they imagine racial discrimination and inequalities as things of the past, supposedly rectified by the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Neoliberal racism aggressively asserts the insignificance of race in contemporary America while simultaneously attempting to eradicate from public discourse any conceptualization of race at odds with an individualist embrace of formal legal rights. Giroux goes on to say, neoliberal racism provides the ideological and legal framework for asserting that since American society is now a meritocracy, government should be race-neutral, affirmative action programs dismantled, civil rights laws discarded, and the welfare state eliminated. Neoliberal racism also dismisses any notion of institutionalized white racism against people of color. Any evidence of institutionalized racism is dismissed as an isolated incident, the result of the racial prejudices of a few racist white individuals. For proponents of neoliberal racism, it is a person's consciousness of race, one's noticing, perceiving, and thinking about American social life through racial categories, that is the race problem in post-civil rights America. Purveyors of neoliberal racism often erroneously assert that if people only truly stopped seeing race or making it matter, then racial prejudice, discrimination, and inequalities would cease to exist. Giroux's work also emphasizes that neoliberal racism requires cultural work in order for its logics and ideologies to be established as racial common sense in new millennium America. For Giroux, media culture must be understood as a key site through which the ideas and values of neoliberal racism are generated and made popular. One of the most prominent ways the logics of neoliberal racism are popularized is through the production of effectively appealing feel-good stories of American individuals of various racial and ethnic backgrounds whose success is explained simply as the product of their extraordinary talents, will, hard work, and good choices. These narratives of neoliberal racism feature the evasion of race talk and displacement, if not erasure, of the influence of racism and racial structure on social life. Even as the explicit mentioning of race is evaded in these narratives to promote the idea of a post-racial America, race is paradoxically always on display as these heroic neoliberal figures strategically come from various racial and ethnic groups and their successes ironically prove that race no longer matters in the neoliberal moment. Or, as Hasanoff describes it in her analysis of the reality TV modeling contest program, America's Next Top Model, this neoliberal rhetoric of race denies the political importance of race while superficially embracing racial difference. Such stories of neoliberal exceptionalism are prevalent in 2000s America. As these stories purportedly promote the main ideological elements of neoliberal racism, self-reliance, hyper-individualism, competition, hard work, racial meritocracy, and racial color blindness, they implicitly serve the racial interests of neoliberal, white, America as they mystify the influence of structural racism and white privilege on the life opportunities of all Americans and promote the fiction that we live in a post-racial moment. Contemporary America gets rendered visible as a colorblind meritocracy where racial obstacles no longer limit, or invisibly privilege, any American individual to achieve the American dream. Any notion of systemic racial privilege or disadvantage conveniently disappears as success is trumpeted as the product of the will of the individual, whose race no longer matters. In the rest of this chapter, I illuminate how the two chief narratives constitutive of the media spectacle of Freddy mania are crafted from the logics of the neoliberal racial imaginary. These narratives jointly constitute the media's dominant framing of Adu's immigration experience and set the conditions for Freddy mania not only to turn a profit for neoliberal, white, America but also to establish a public common sense about Freddy Adu, and his mother Amelia, that enables neoliberal, white, America to imagine itself as colorblind and racially progressive for their embrace of hard-working black people who are deemed worthy of the rewards they have earned because they are black American subjects who appreciate the opportunities neoliberal America has generously provided for them. Freddy Adu as neoliberal American dream citizen. At the most intense time of Freddy mania, the moment of Adu turning pro, the most prominent narrative constitutive of his public identity was his repeated articulation as a symbol of a new and different version of the American dream. For example, in a BBC online story, Adu is represented as the epitome of the modern American dream. On another website, Adu is said to be shaping up to be soccer's version of the American dream. Sporting narratives announcing a new American athletic talent as the embodiment of the American dream are hardly new in American media culture. But, within the post-civil rights context, when this next great American athlete is black, this sporting narrative functions not only to elucidate the fulfillment of the American dream but also America's imagined racial progress. Yet, within this context where this conventional sporting narrative is repeatedly told, how do we make sense of the media's portrayal of Adu's story as somehow modern and different? Similar to the way in which Tiger Woods' commodified media spectacle generated at the moment of his turning pro enabled post-civil rights, white America to imagine itself as a racially progressive multicultural and post-racial family, a racialized spectacle that augmented normative whiteness, Freddy Mania offers a story of race that neoliberal, white America gets to tell itself as it superficially embraces and trades on Freddy Adu's unique sporting talents and immigration story. In particular, through Freddy Mania, neoliberal, white America gets to imagine itself as a racially progressive, multicultural nation that welcomes immigrants of color into the American citizenry/family. Yet, this discursive embrace of Adu is only conditional and dependent on the sanitization of the racial aspects of his family's immigration story and the reification of the paternalism of neoliberal American normative whiteness. To understand how this conditional embrace of Adu in and through Freddy Mania requires the racial sanitization of his immigration story, we must first outline a bit about African immigration to the United States since 1965. African immigration to the United States has quadrupled in the past 2 decades due to a complex set of factors: the rise of more restrictive immigration policies and anti-immigrant sentiments in Europe during the 1970s, the 1965 U.S. immigration law abolishing immigration quotas set aside for Western Europeans and Canadians, the 1980 Refugee Act, and the more recent Diversity Visa Program, which in 1995 allocated 20,200 visas for Africans. Yet, this rise in African immigration has only received limited public attention. The New York Times cover story in 2007 given to the Fugees youth soccer team of rural Georgia made up of African refugees is a rare exception. Yet, the bidding war that ensued between Hollywood film production companies over the rights to turn the Fugees story into a motion picture suggests not only the presumed profitability of this story but also that hopeful, optimistic, and inspiring stories of African immigration, centered on African immigrant youths, as opposed to African immigrant adults, enable a particular story of new millennium America, one that activates the ideas, logics, and interests of the neoliberal, white, racial imagination, to be told. But unlike the story of the Fugees, which includes details of war, genocide, family separation, and struggle here in the United States, or for that matter Amadou Diallo's tragic murder by 41 shots from New York City policemen, Adu's youthful immigration experience is rendered visible in a clean, uncontroversial, and racially sanitized way. Even before officially becoming naturalized as an American citizen, Adu was frequently portrayed as simply American. So, given the long American history where black people have had difficulty being articulated with the category of American, which is too often implicitly articulated/imagined as a white category, and the contemporary moment when the immigration of people of color to the United States is a volatile domestic issue, how do we make sense of the ease to which Adu is articulated as American? To understand Adu's rather easy articulation as an embodiment of the American dream, one must critically examine the specific details through which the immigration experience of Freddy and his family are narrated in and through Freddy Mania. Countless media stories represented Adu's immigration experience to the United States as simply the lucky product of his family winning a U.S. diversity visa lottery in Ghana, without giving further details. Some stories supplement this detail with a story casting Adu's mother, Amelia, as an Horatio Alger-esque American immigrant figure who sacrificially worked long hours and multiple jobs to provide for her family. Notably absent from any of the media discourse on Freddy Adu are any details of Amelia's early experiences in the United States which, if they were anything like the common experiences of many recent African immigrants, were likely defined by struggles to find work and provide for her family, to acclimate to her new cultural surroundings, and to overcome feelings of isolation and separation from her close-knit family in Ghana. At the same time, Freddy's early experiences living in the United States are portrayed as uncomplicatedly positive. His extraordinary soccer talents and warm personality are represented as enabling him to quickly become popular with peers and one parent, Arnold Tarzi, who becomes a close family friend/advisor to the Aegis. Tarzi is represented as the one who first signs up Freddy to play travel team soccer in Maryland. These opportunities, generated from Freddy's natural talents, warm personality, and supportive white Americans like Tarzi, in turn led to Inter Milan's extraordinary $750,000 offer to sign Freddy at the age of 10 after he starred in a tournament in Italy while playing for Tarzi's traveling team. Through this selective detailing of Adu's family's experience of immigrating to the United States, the discursive logics and strategies constitutive of the neoliberal racial imaginary become apparent. First and foremost, Adu's story evades any discussion of the relevance of race and racism to his experience. Next, Adu is discursively fashioned into a neoliberal, phenotypically black/post-racial/African immigrant/ yet not disruptive of normative whiteness, American subject through the selective tailoring of his family's immigration tale to generically fit the narrative structure of the Horatio Alger mythology of the American dream. This use of the Alger immigration mythology to narrate the Agis immigration experience is the sign that the Agis blackness, coded as it is hardworking, grateful, America-loving, assimilationist, disciplined, and docile, has racial value to neoliberal normative whiteness. Through this selective and racially sanitizing immigration narrative, any complexities, difficulties, and ambivalences that Adu may have endured due to race or racism are displaced. At the same time, the America Freddy and his mother encounter in this narrative is one marked by the generosity of white patriarchal figures and agencies embodied first in Tarzi and later by U.S. Soccer and MLS, which get positioned as white paternal presences willing to benevolently provide the American dream to Freddy alongside, and always only if they have the consent of, his mother, Amelia. But as will become apparent later, as I discuss below, neoliberal, white, America's embrace of young Freddy precariously rests on his unwavering demonstration of commitment to hard work, humility, deference to white, male, authority, unquestioned love of America, and development into the United States' first international soccer superstar. In Freddy Mania, Freddy's commitment to these values is frequently demonstrated through his own voice, where he repeatedly professes his love of America and the unlimited opportunities it provides while affirming his desire to work hard, make good choices, and do everything within his power to become America's first international soccer superstar. Neoliberal, white, America's celebration and commodification of Adu through this sanitized American dream narrative enables it to imagine itself in the new millennium as a colorblind and post-racial meritocracy where Adu's athletic accomplishments and wealth are imagined as the product of the multitude of opportunities available to black individuals now that America is no longer burdened by racial prejudices and inequalities of opportunity based on race. This neoliberal interpretation of the success of black individuals is popular today despite data showing that racial polarization, segregation, and disparities in employment, wealth, housing, educational achievement, incarceration rates, etc., are greater today than in 1970. The modern or different aspect of Adu's representation as iconic embodiment of the American dream lies in the ability of Adu's post-racial blackness and recent immigration from Ghana to the United States to seemingly legitimate the idea that a new millennium America, let alone post-civil rights America, race is no longer a barrier for black individuals who are willing to work hard and to invest themselves in the right values of neoliberal, white, culture, i.e., hard work, hyper-individualism, faith in the free market, entrepreneurialism, self-transformation and self-optimization, and evasion of racial thinking, as opposed to the values of dependency and victimhood often ascribed to urban African American underclasses or the values of racialism associated with African American advocates, activists, and critics. Although never explicitly named, Adu's African immigrant status, his immigration story, and his subsequent fame and fortune in this neoliberal American land of plenty enable neoliberal, white, America to implicitly castigate African Americans born in the United States who cite continued institutionalized racism and inequalities, in education, employment, housing, voting, etc., in post-civil rights America for their present misfortunes or personal failures. Even further, by narrating Adu's immigration story as an uniquely American one, America can even be lauded as providing better opportunities for a black person living anywhere in the world today. As some assert, Adu would likely not be as wealthy nor famous as he is today if he had not been lucky enough to come to the United States. Perhaps the clearest evidence of the political stakes involved in this neoliberal, white, American dream rendering of Adu is the U.S. State Department's own participation in the construction and marketing of this racially sanitized version of Adu's immigration story as evidence of the plethora of opportunities available to new immigrants of color who emigrate to the United States through its diversity visa program. Indeed, Adu's story of immigrating to the United States is repeatedly celebrated not only by the State Department but also by liberal proponents of the U.S.'s diversity visa program as the shining exemplar of the value immigrants of color can provide to the nation. Of course, this racial sanitization of Adu's American dream immigration story also sets the ground enabling him to be commodified whether to sell Nike products, Pepsi soft drinks, MLS tickets, or U.S. soccer merchandise to American consumers willing to invest themselves in the ideas of race, racism, America, and immigration to which he is made to symbolize. The black familial politics of neoliberal racism. Another storyline repeatedly featured in Freddy Mania features Freddy's mother, Amelia, and praises her for the sacrifices she's made, working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet for Freddy and his brother, to provide for her family. Amelia Adu's sacrifices, hard work, and parental discipline are forwarded as a key influence on Freddy's wholesome character, strong work ethic, and quick maturation, which enabled him to make a smooth and successful transition to professional soccer at the age of 14. While this inspiring narrative of hope and optimism appears at first as a welcome departure from the racialized demonization of single motherhood of the 1980s and 1990s, it advances the ideas and logics of a neoliberal racial project by implying that race and racism no longer matter in new millennium America by lionizing Ms. Adu in typical neoliberal fashion for choosing hard work, individualism, personal sacrifice, and self-reliance over dependency, victimhood, and bearing witness to new millennium America's continued racial inequalities and discrimination. Amelia Adu's neoliberal narrative of self-reliance and excellence in parenting was most often conveyed via a story about her turning down Inter Milan's $750,000 offer to sign Freddy at the age of 10 after he starred in a tournament in Italy. Key to this story is her refusal of this extraordinary amount of money even as she, a single mother, was struggling to make ends meet, working 2 jobs around the clock to provide for her 2 sons. As the story goes, despite the enormous amount of money offered to Amelia and Freddy by the world-renowned Italian football club, she refused their approach without a second thought as she felt that sending Freddy to Italy at such a young age to become a professional footballer was inappropriate. In her mind, such an experience would compromise both Freddy's personal development and her desire to see Freddy get a quality education in the United States. This story lauding Ms. Adu's excellent parenting of Freddy is supplemented by other instances of Freddy crediting his mother for instilling in him the proper values, hard work, humility, willingness to pay his dues, deference to coaches, etc. that have enabled him to become an elite soccer player. In one such interview, Freddy recalls how, during his years at the U.S. Youth Development Residency Program, a time when Amelia could not afford to travel from Maryland to Florida to see Freddy, she would often end their phone conversations by reminding him to always be humble. At first glance, this celebratory narrative lauding Amelia Adu for her positive influence on Freddy appears to be a progressive and welcome departure from the derogatory and demonizing narratives and representations of young black males as gangsters and thugs and single black mothers as welfare moms that regularly circulated during the 1980s and 1990s. As these incendiary racial narratives produced images of single black mothers as irresponsible welfare moms draining federal tax monies, often imagined as coming straight from the pockets of hard-working, white, middle-class Americans, they simultaneously relied on, as they produced, images of young black males as deviant, irresponsible, uncaring, and selfish absent fathers prone to criminality, a lack of industriousness, drug use, undisciplined sexuality, and violence. Deploying the logics of the neoliberal racial imaginary, these stories contain the social problems afflicting urban America, rendering them visible as the supposed product of the black community's impoverishment of values and the deficient wills of black individuals living there. These stories effectively erase the continued existence and effects of white privilege/white racism in post-civil rights America while masking the devastating effects of the neoliberal, global economy and disinvestment on urban black communities. Importantly, the narrative served as the discursive conduits through which neoliberal, white, America rationalized the gutting of federal welfare programs for the poor, a key aim of the neoliberalist agenda. So, on the face of things, this framing of Amelia's positive influence on Freddy could easily be read as a racially progressive story because it fails to perpetuate the racist representations of young black men and single black mothers that dominated the 1980s and early 1990s. But, such a reading of this neoliberal narrative praising Amelia Adu's self-reliance and disciplined parenting, drenched as it is in its inspirational, positive, and optimistic tone, fails to recognize how this narrative activates the logics of neoliberal racism. This particular casting of Amelia Adu as a good neoliberal, black/African immigrant/post-racial, American citizen and distanced from bad dependent American-born black subjects facilitates neoliberal, white, America's embrace of Freddy. This conditional acceptance is a reward for Freddy's and his mom's repeatedly professed faith in American neoliberal ideas like racial meritocracy, self-reliance, self-optimization, and love of country. The Ages are accepted into America's post-racial imagined community because their story enables race to appear not to matter, and institutionalized racism is hard to even imagine. Ideas that neoliberal, white, America, tired of being forced to contemplate white privilege and moral responsibility over America's racial wrongs, both in the past and present, is desperate to convince itself are true. Even further, this portrayal of Adu's story appears to provide seemingly irrefutable proof that black achievement in new millennium America is merely a matter of black individuals' willingness to submit to the values of neoliberalism, i.e., refusal of dependency on the government, faith in the market, and refusal to bear witness to the impact of race on the social. As recent immigrants to the United States, the Adu's American Dream story, bolstered by tales of Ms. Adu's sacrifices, hard work, and good choices, enables neoliberals to characterize American-born African Americans' claims that continued systemic racism and racial inequalities in the United States limits their ability to realize their American dreams as little more than an excuse for their own failures of will. As Ms. Adu's influence is cast as a key influence producing Freddy's disciplined docility, it also performs the crucial function of distancing Adu's youthful black masculinity from notions of black masculinity as criminal, hypersexual, defiant, and undisciplined, which enable America's celebration, embrace, and commodification of Freddy. Adu's commodification potential is always dependent upon his imagined distance and difference from a thuggish, undisciplined urban, young, black masculinity demonized for its alleged failure of will. It is perhaps useful to consider here America's embracing of Freddy Adu in relation to the lack of respect and scorn afforded to Jody, the protagonist in John Singleton's New Millennium film, Baby Boy, who symbolizes this form of American black masculinity. The importance of Singleton's Jody to Freddy Adu's story is that Jody represents the invisible other within the public lionization of Adu through Freddy mania. That is, Jody represents every black American male whose social demonization by, or, at least, lack of compassion from, neoliberal, white, America is, at least in part, predicated on and derived from its explanation of Freddy's success as a product of his extraordinary will cultivated by his mother's disciplined example. Neoliberal, white, America's love of young black men like Freddy Adu attempts to hide, even as it is implicitly used to justify, its resentful contempt for young black men like Jody. Stated a bit differently, neoliberal, white, America celebrates Freddy's story of success, as a product of black will and agency, in order to convince itself it plays no role in producing the racial and economic conditions that produce Jody's story. In short, the stories of Freddy and Jody are two opposing sides of the same coin of neoliberal racism. Some recent events in Adu's life have shown the conditional limits of Adu's embrace by white America and how quickly Adu's media image and public perception can shift from the Freddy to the Jody side of this neoliberal racial coin. The first took place at the end of the 2005 MLS season when Adu complained to the press about not starting in a match after having won Player of the Week honors after he scored an amazing goal in DC United's previous game. In response to this and other sporadic, yet much publicized, conflicts with DC United's authoritarian coach, Peter Novak, sports writers and American soccer fans frequently mobilized a coded racist rhetoric that compared Adu with the likes of Terrell Owens, who at the time represented the poster child for young, black, masculine athletic arrogance, self-centeredness, and petulance. The harsh, pedantic tone of the criticism levied at Adu along with this repeated comparison to Owens evidence how Adu's acceptance in neoliberal, post-racial/white normative, America is precarious and conditioned upon his strict adherence to a black masculine subjectivity that is phenotypically black, post-racial, yet, ostensibly normatively white and that consistently defers to white masculine authority. The second example took place in the summer of 2006 upon the U.S. men's national team's elimination from the World Cup at the feet of Ghana, Adu's native homeland. Immediately afterward, the American sports media sought out Adu's reaction to the match. In initial interviews, for the first time, Adu expressed ambivalence about playing for the United States in future World Cups. In one interview he even suggested he would strongly consider playing for Ghana if given the opportunity, even implying that Ghana's soccer future looked brighter than the United States. Conspicuously absent from his initial comments was his previous constantly reiterated promise to one day proudly take the field for the United States, which the media always held up as proof of Adu's love for his adopted country in the media discourses of Freddy mania. The following day Adu went on Pardon the Interruption, PTI, to clarify his original statement. On PTI, Adu attempted to clarify his original statement by saying that playing for the United States was his first choice, but he could not take for granted that the opportunity to play for the United States would come and thus he must keep open the option of playing for Ghana. His comments did not satisfy a portion of those U.S. fans whose immediate resentful responses revealed a surprising level of racialized animosity and white paternalism toward Adu, at least a surprise to those strongly invested in the validity of the logics of neoliberal racism. Many of Adu's critics lambasted him for his supposed ungratefulness toward the United States which, from their perspective, provided him with the opportunity, fame, and riches he would not have experienced anywhere else in the world. On the global internet message board, BigSoccer.com, about 1/4 of the reactions of apparent fans of U.S. soccer castigated Adu. The clearest expression of the duplicity and limits of neoliberal, white, America's embrace of Freddy came from the comments of BigSoccer.com member, Outcast. I say that if Adu chooses Ghana over the U.S. should deport him and his family. This is the sort of stuff that is wrong with America. Everybody wants to be an American until it is convenient or otherwise beneficial for them to suddenly decide, oh, you know what, since I was born in Ghana, I'll be Ghanaian. It should not work that way. In my opinion, you are American or not. Support the country that supports you. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. But by golly, it should. This quick transformation of Adu from savior of American soccer to just another selfish black athlete or ungrateful immigrant of color worthy of immediate deportation exposes the deceit of neoliberal racism. Race still does matter, even if its influences and effects manifest without explicit racial marking or sign of blatantly racist rhetoric. Conclusion. In this chapter, I have argued that Freddy Adu was manufactured into a sporting celebrity because particular aspects of his life, his recent immigration to the United States, his smiling, disciplined, youthful phenotypically black/post-racial/ yet normatively white masculinity, his deference to agents of white patriarchy, his repeatedly professed childlike love of America, and his potential to become America's first global soccer superstar, enabled his story to operate as an inimitable popular cultural vehicle to disseminate, popularize, and naturalize the ideas and logics constitutive of the neoliberal racial imaginary. Indeed, Freddy mania operates as a first-rate profit-making and ideological vehicle of neoliberal racism because Adu's story appears, I suspect to most readers, to be an unmediated and transparently factual story authorized, in many cases, through quotes from Freddy and Amelia Adu themselves. The apparent truthfulness of Adu's story makes any critical reading of the conservative racial politics that implicitly constitute his sporting celebrity, like the one I offer here, often difficult to see and accept for many Americans outside academia, especially those interpolated by, and invested in, the ideas and logics of neoliberal racism. This is particularly true for culturally conservative members of neoliberal, white, America who, in their words, are presently exhausted by black Americans playing the race card or who regard any public discussion of race as part of a racial guilt industry intent on punishing contemporary whites for past racial wrongs they feel they haven't committed. But, it can also be true for Americans of more moderate, liberal, or even progressive ilks who naively imagine racism solely in terms of individual prejudice, rather than as institutionalized and systemic, believe in color blindness as a viable mode of anti-racism, or recognize the United States as a morally superior multicultural nation relative to more monoculturalist national others in the post-9/11 world. The insidious racial/racist politics of Freddy mania are also difficult to discern, especially as his story features in the national/global media spotlight, has made Adu into a multimillionaire, and is expressed through a narrative that employs an optimistic, hopeful, and inspirational tone that, at first glance, seems to resist negative black stereotypes while casting Freddy and his mother, Amelia, as strong, determined, and self-disciplined African/American individuals who appear to achieve the American dream through their own individual will and hard work. I must admit that as a fanatic supporter of the men's U.S. national soccer team, and owner of a U.S. hero jersey adorned with Adu's name, who was initially seduced by Freddy mania, it was difficult at first to even contemplate Adu's commodified celebrity and media spectacle as part of a new, more insidious form of cultural racism. Indeed, it was in and through the process of constructing this analysis that I was able to recognize how Freddy mania only appears to the extent that corporate behemoths like Nike, Pepsi, Major League Soccer, U.S. Soccer, the U.S. state, and neoliberal, white, America simultaneously authorize and generate economic and political racial value from his story. Indeed, the commodification of Adu's soccer talents, whether through the selling of hero jerseys, U.S. soccer merchandise, MLS tickets, or Sierra Mist, is mediated through, and dependent upon, the meanings about race, racism, immigration, neoliberalism, and white America that can be articulated in and through his story. Neoliberal, white, America's affection for Freddy, like its love/hate for too many contemporary black male athletes, is conditional upon the strategic ways in which Adu can be racialized to allow them to imagine themselves how they would like to be recognized, as non-racist, caring, and compassionate American citizens who are open to all regardless of race or ethnicity. Yet, closer inspection of neoliberal, white, America's apparent affection for Freddy Adu reveals its conditional quality, its white paternalism, its neglect of socially marginalized, oppressed, and vulnerable black American citizens, its impulse to punish those who do not subscribe to its ideologies, its dependence on the generation of profits, and its celebration of people of color in selective and strategic ways that resecure normative whiteness while fostering the illusion of living in a post-racial moment. It is imperative all Americans recognize how optimistic neoliberal racist narratives lionizing heroic people of color that explain their successes as a product of their individual agency alone to imply that race is no longer a barrier in American society are one cultural means through which the ideas and logics of the neoliberal racial imagination get secured as the common-sense way in which many, if not most, Americans imagine race and racism in new millennium America. Failing to bear witness to, understand, and then challenge the racial politics that underlie and are activated by these seemingly banal and unpolitical, feel-good neoliberal spectacles like Freddy Mania implicates each of us as part of the social system reproducing America's racial asymmetries of power and socio-economic inequalities in this supposed post-racial moment. Postscript. It's just 17 days until the 2010 World Cup begins in South Africa. Tonight, the U.S. men's national team faces the Czech Republic in the first of 3 friendly matches intended to prepare the U.S. team for the World Cup. Freddy Adu will not be wearing the red, white, and blue this evening. Nor will he represent the United States for the first World Cup ever held on African soil. After reviving national and international faith in his extraordinary footballing talents with a strong showing at the 2007 Under-20 World Cup, Adu realized his dream of playing professional football in Europe by moving from the MLS to the legendary Portuguese club, Benfica, for a $2 million transfer fee. Unable to crack Benfica's starting 11 during his first season, Adu experienced 2 unsuccessful loan spells to clubs in France and Portugal over the next season and a half. In January 2010, in what many have described as his last shot to make it in European football, Adu signed with Greek First Division club, Aris Thessaloniki, on an 18-month loan. Unlike his previous stints in Portugal and France, Adu has made a number of starts for Aris, scoring a pair of goals and contributing several assists over the last 5 months of the 2009-2010 Greek season. Yet, his recent displays of renewed form were not enough for U.S. coach Bob Bradley to select Adu for the U.S. World Cup team. Adu's omission from the United States 2010 World Cup squad has not generated anywhere near as much media attention as his introduction to the American soccer public 6 years ago. Perhaps this absence of media coverage for Adu's exclusion is not worthy of critical analysis. Many will surely say that he is, after all, only 20 years old, and it is rare for a player of that age to make any country's final World Cup roster. But, I cannot seem to overlook the deafening silence within the American soccer media. Yes, there is a niche American soccer media, over Adu's omission. Top American soccer writer, Grant Wall's, story in the April 19 issue of Sports Illustrated is an exception. Interestingly, his story carries the headline, "Didn't you used to be the future?" Immediately I recall the title to Wall's contribution to Freddy Mania from 7 years earlier, Who's Next? Freddy Adu. Wall's article begins to trouble me halfway through reading it when the thought creeps into my mind that he's writing Adu's public/sporting obituary. I begin to wonder, why must this Adu die? Is there no room for this Freddy Adu if he's not the next black athlete whose unique, different, and stylized footballing talents neoliberal, white, America can profit from, imagine itself as, and/or consider as one of us in order to imagine itself as benevolent, colorblind, and non-racist in the present, if not the future? And non-racist in the present, if not the future, and non-racist in the present, if not the future, and non-racist in the present, if not the future, and non-racist in the present,